Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the first and only video on our subgroup processing. Basically, this is a very simple concept. The first thing that I want to let you know about the subgroup processing is to do a good job as you can to make it sound as good as you possibly think it can sound as a mix unto itself. And be prepared that you're probably going to have to change that when you go into mixing if you have a fairly complicated mix, because sometimes you might have to low pass or high pass filter things out some when you get it into the mix, because it doesn't sound as good mixed in with everything else as it does by itself. So just keep that in mind. The other thing is that sometimes on my subgroups, that on my tracks, if I'm not really sure about stuff, that I'll have, effects on them, things or processors, equalizers, whatever is going on. I try, so to save processing power in CPU, is I try, if I'm pretty sure about it, I render the track so that I don't have any inserts on the tracks themselves at this point. But sometimes I'm really not sure. So sometimes sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. I try not to, if at all possible, to leave any type of processors on those individual tracks. So now, and to keep in mind that this is initial stage of processing before we start mixing. So this is what it's basically completely designed to have a place to fall back to, so that when you do your mixing and you do your processing for the mix, that you can fall back to this bus. That's the subgroup mix bus, and you can fall back again to the tracks to fix things. You might have a problem with equalization. It might be the trumpet that's causing the problem. You don't want to be adjusting processors for the whole subgroup or for the whole mix just because of a trumpet that's the problem on one track. So it gives you some layers to fall back on so that you can repair things. So basically, you should have mixed everything in your subgroup as well as you think it can sound. You've done any work you can do with on the track. You might have done some more equalization work on some of the tracks. You might have even done some sculpting like we did in processing, effects, all kinds of things, and then hopefully been able to render that. Just save a copy of the track that you didn't do that to, just in case. And trust me on that. And when you get into your subgroup mixing, basically you've created a bus that's, for the subgroup. So, hopefully in your DAW that, it's pretty simple that, you just create a bus for add a bus for the selected channels. And on your bus that, the first thing we talked about, that preset. So that's going to be the first thing that's on there. That's going to be some kind of spatialization that you've agreed for the whole mix. That I've decided the St. Petersburg Cathedral on this open air convolution reverb is what's going on in the whole mix. On some of them, then it'd be very little, almost none, and some it might be a lot. Depends on how it pans out in the mix. And I have that analog delay that we talked about. That is the set preset. So you'd have to go back and at the end of processing and look at the preset configuration we talked about, because basically that preset is going to set the space like everything in the production was recorded in the same place, so you don't have conflicting reverberations, conflicting echo effects, conflicting things like that, because it can just cause a muddy mess. So just, that's the first thing that goes on there. Normally I have that off until I get done mixing. Once I get done mixing, then I'll add it into it, because sometimes not. I want to hear what it sounds like while I'm mixing, and I'll turn it off because I want to hear clarity, because sometimes the clarity is more important, and then going, okay, now I want to bring the spatialization up into it and see how it sounds as a mix, and that's coming from each individual track or each individual subgroup, because you have subgroups in separate tracks that are going to be being mixed together. So I normally turn those off for now, because I don't make any decision on that until after I'm mixing, because I don't know how much of that I can put on, the guitar until I've mixed it together, so I make sure I don't cause mud. So besides that, we're talking about you can add effects. At this point, you might want to add effects. I mean, you might want to add multitudes of different effects on that subgroup that make it sound good. Chorus is a really cool one. Sometimes chorus can be great because it can just fill it out. You know, it's like almost doing working on broadening the stereo field a little bit with chorus effects and things like that. So, I mean, that's an option to do stuff like that. Or you can also add things like, stereo field tools. Sometimes that you might get in there and you want to do things like stereo field tools, like imagers, to stereoize it and to try to broaden the stereo field so the stereo field's a little bit broader, on that subgroup. You're trying to mix that mix so it sounds as good as it can by itself. So those are, it's a couple different things, effects, stereo field enhancers and things like that to try to enhance the stereo field of that subgroup or things like that, or the individual track itself. And then, you've got this. One of the reasons why I'm telling you this is because this is a lot of reason why sometimes you'll see novice people, they'll watch a mixing engineer at the end of his production turn the EQ up at the very end, just a little notch right at, 3,000 hertz, and they're going, that's all the EQ work he did on the whole mix. How did he do that? Mine doesn't work that way, because he did all this kind of work on the individual tracks and the subgroups, hopefully, so that he had great stuff to work with, so you don't have to fuss with it at the end. Because you don't want to be doing a bunch of processing at the very end because you're processing the whole mix. So you want to be real careful of that. Go back and deal with the subgroup bus or the individual tracks themselves, trying to get them to sound as good as possible so that they make the mix sound as good as possible when they're brought into the mix. And then equalization. Normally that most of the time on that subgroup bus, I'm going to do a high and low pass filter on it to try to knock out anything in the higher end and the lower end that I don't need. I sit back and go, I can bring some low end out of it and some high end out of it and make sure I'm not taking away from it sounding good, but cutting out any stuff that's not needed. Unneeded content just causes mud and mess. So, any of it you can cut out. And you might do a little bit of subtractive EQ work at this point. You might go in there and go, oh, well, right here, I think right there, I'm sweeping around and I got this sound a little bit right there. I'll go back and what is that? Is that the trumpet, the trombone, or something in there? If it's a group of vocals of the same vocal or a group of guitars that are playing the same thing but different tracks, that you might not go back to those individual tracks. You can just deal with it right there. A little bit of subtractive EQ work also. And then I'll go through and EQ that. So I'm basically will go back through and equalize that subgroup. So I might not have to do anything at all. I'll go back to the individual tracks and adjust things I think I need. But sometimes I'll go in there because, we've talked about the equal loudness contour, and we've talked about equalization when we were doing, processing. And, going back through and after you've mixed something, it's a really good idea to go back, especially when it's a subgroup that may be a lot the same instrument, that, but different types of it, that, with the processing techniques we talked about, that, I went in here and I'm going to buy, this is in the areas, first of all, around the equal loudness contour dictates where I should attenuate and boost. And I'm going through there and boosting and attenuating those areas. If I hear something needs a little bit of low end, it needs up in here, it needs to be pulled down here a little bit, it needs to go up here in the high end, needs a lot more high end up in there, and get it equalized for that subgroup, so that subgroup sounds as good as possible. So, it's another step, because now you don't just have those individual tracks, you've got a subgroup that you're going to equalize that, so it sounds as good as possible. So basically at that point that you can do things like some more sound sculpting and things like that if you want, that we talked about, like in processing, or any one of the processing techniques we talked on that bus itself if you'd like. Just be careful. You get too many processors on here, you start to bog down your computer. It's like, so, and it's like on the buses, it's okay. If you do this to all your tracks and your buses and you're working on some of it, you do, you don't, whatever, until it comes out sounding great. Be careful of having a bunch of processors on all your buses, your subgroup buses, and your individual tracks and your subgroup tracks. Because if you got that many processors going on, that can really cause a problem. So keep that in mind. So, basically at that point, you're basically have processed it. You know, you go through and think about these things, and you basically want to make that subgroup sound as good as possible. Get that spatialization preset that we put together that's got some type of reverb and the analog delay on there that's been set as what you're going to use for all the individual tracks and subgroups for the mix, so they sound like they're recorded in the same place. You've done some, you know, maybe effects work on it. You've maybe done some stereo field work on it or something like that. And you've done some equalization and whatever else you might want to do to it to make it sound good. Now, the only other thing that I do recommend besides that, and then once you get done, just make sure you got your volume down to at least like -3 dB, you know, so that you got yourself a little bit of headroom there. Does that make sense? And you might have to if you do a lot of equalization work. But bring it down and set them down. You have a set so that it's just, you don't have to think about it. I know I set it down to -3 dB when I'm done. And the only other thing I wanted to talk about is any of this processing you did here. Let's say that you've done delay work like we had talked about, like you've got 12.2 millisecond delay here. You've done some detuning work, things like that. You've detuned it -3 cents. This is all processing. If you do this to a lot of tracks, your DAW is processing this. This isn't just rendered on the track on the piece of audio. Any delays you do on that track with that kind of work of delays, detunings, and things like that are processing. So it's going to eat up CPU power and things like that, and it'll slow down your DAW and can cause you a problem. So make notes about it and render the track. You know, go into it and, render the dang track. On here, it's 12.2 milliseconds. I just can select this here. Once I'm done on that, and I can command bounce that, and it's done. Does that make sense? Oops, sorry, not on this DAW. My apologies. That you have to render the track. So basically, sometimes you might have to put some kind of processor on here that's doing nothing. Like, I have a processor that's called a mix tool that I have it on there doing nothing so that I can render the track, and it actually isn't doing anything to the sound at all, but I'll transfer it to rendered audio so that is transferred to rendered audio so that my DAW doesn't have to do all that work. It went down because I had a bunch of other processors on there when I did that, but so the DAW doesn't have to do all this work all the time while it's going along. Does that make sense? Because it's going to eat CPU power. Trying to do that, especially on a big production, can cause a huge problem. So just save a copy of it and make good notes about it. And any processors you're going to have an individual track, take them off first before you render and then put them back on. Save them as a preset or something, or drag them onto a different track so that you don't have to fuss with them, and then drag them back onto that track or whatever so that you can render that so that your computer isn't having to process that, in real time throughout your whole production while you're working. Because, if you do a lot of real complicated processing like that, it can cause a problem. So other than that, you're pretty good to go. At that point, normally that I'm going to send mine out to the main out. Does that make sense? I myself, I have what I call a leveling bus that I use to adjust dynamics throughout the whole mix. After I get done working on all the individual tracks or the individual subgroups and doing automation on them, that everything's sent to a leveling bus that I can adjust the levels of the whole mix between sections from the leveling bus. And so then I'll send this from this to that, and then from the leveling bus it goes to all the different processors when I'm done mixing to do any processing I need to do on the entire mix. And it's a pretty simple concept. There's not a whole lot else to do in trying to, it's a work in progress. So you really need to work at being able to do that well and understand that you may change that when you start mixing things together, things that you got it sounding great as a submix unto itself, but with other things mixed together, it might not sound as good. You might have to change it, but we'll talk about that in mixing. So I hope you enjoyed this video on subgroup processing, and I'll see you in the next video when we start our mixing.